So the Taoists say, well, the world is made up of yin and yang. That's the terms that they use to conceptualize it, and that's often translated as, you know, yang is masculine and yin is feminine. But that doesn't mean male and female. It means something deeper, which is human beings have a social cognitive architecture. And so, you know, we're from time immemorial, we were used to mapping the world as masculine and feminine, because most of our interactions throughout our evolutionary history have been social and interpersonal interactions. That's the primary reality. And when we developed our, you know, greater cognitive capacity and our ability to abstract, we had to use the conceptual structures that we'd already evolved in order to start mapping out the world abstractly. And so we seem to use masculine and feminine, which is sort of like the primary binary opposition, to represent things that are primarily opposed at the deepest of levels. There's other reasons as well. I mean, chaos is the place from which new things emerge. So if your computer crashes and you have to learn to fix it, then you've extracted a whole bunch of information from what was otherwise just a black box, so to speak, and that makes you more skillful, and it makes your understanding of the world, your detailed representation of the world, more differentiated. So chaos is the place that new information comes out of. And that's partly also why it's feminine, because the feminine is that from which new things emerge. And of course, the orderly element is masculine, at least in part, because we tend to conceive of dominance hierarchies as something like a patriarchal structure. And they are something like that. They're like that among human beings, and they also seem to be like that among chimpanzees, although not so much with the bonobos. So that's an interesting way of thinking about things. And the Taoists would say, those are universal elements of being. No matter where you are, there's things you know and there's things you don't know. And so that's the fundamental problem in your life. How to deal with the things you know and can predict and want, and how to deal with the things that you can't. And then the Taoists would also say, well, you should walk the line between them. That's the right place to be. And that's a very, 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 very smart way of thinking about it, because if you're only ever where you know what's going to happen, you've got two problems. One is, you're not learning anything, because what you already know is already working, so why bother changing it? The second is worse, because order tends to deteriorate of its own accord, right? Because the world itself continues to change. Just entropy will make it change. And so if all you do is stick yourself inside the order itself over time is going to get less and less stable, and then at some point it's not going to be there at all, and you'll fall right into chaos. So you can't just hide over where everything is predictable and where you get what you want. On the other hand, if you're in chaos all the time and you never know what's going on, then you can't tolerate that physiologically. Because the closer you are to serious chaos, the more your body is preparing for the worst. And that's because at the bottom of chaos is the worst. Right? So you see in mythological representations, chaos is the underworld. And in the underworld there's hell, and hell is like the worst place in chaos. And so when you think about conceptions like this, well, people say, well, do those places exist? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on what you mean by exist. Does the domain of chaos exist? Well, how many of you have been there? As soon as you know the language, you think, oh yeah, that exists. I've been where chaos is lots, maybe more than I want to be. And now and then I've even been in that part of chaos that's best described as hell. So that's the sort of chaos that you visit where everything you do makes it worse. And you know, I'm sure that you people, at least some of you, have been in that situation, you know, where things went wrong, and then because of your own foolishness or because of the malevolence of other people, you know, the situation developed so that it went from bad to horrible with each successive decision. That's a place that people can go. It's a very real place. Might be more real than anything else. So the Taoists say, well, you know, the chaos issue, well, you just can't tolerate too much of that. What your body does when it doesn't know what's going on is basically prepare you for anything that might happen. You know, and that's the generalized stress response, and that's associated with massive release of cortisol, and that puts you on alert, and that's great. You're awake and ready, but, you know, a couple of years of that and you're old. Your body just cannot tolerate that level of energy expenditure on a constant basis. It wears you out. It makes you old, fundamentally. So bored or terrified. Those are sort of the extremes of chaos and order, let's say. If you're on the line down the middle, well then you're secure enough so you're not experiencing a level of negative emotion that's intolerable. A little apprehension, that might be a good thing. You know, imagine that you're preparing to meet someone that you're interested in. Well, is the apprehension a good part of that or a bad part? Like, would you do without that? Well, you might if it's like paralyzing you to the point where you can hardly even go through with talking to them. But if it's just part of expectation, that's part of excitement. You know, so when you're on that border between chaos and order, you don't want to be so orderly that you're entirely comfortable. And that's partly because you're asleep then. Like, why the hell do you have to be awake if everything's going your way? You know, and if you're driving home in your car and nothing is going on, you're kind of not even there. You know, maybe you're thinking about things in the future, but you're certainly not attending in any real deep sense to what's going on around you. And that's because you don't have to. Well, when you're a little apprehensive, well then you're more conscious, you know, and then you're more engaged in reality. And then there's the positive emotions that are associated with that too, which is excitement and enthusiasm and curiosity and hope. And all those things are, in some sense, all those things are worth living for. And part of the reason that the Taoists believe that you should walk the line between chaos and order is because it's at that place where the quality of your existence is high enough so that the problems that we discussed, the existential problems we discussed, are no longer particularly relevant. And you know, you might say, well, what's the meaning of life? And I might say, well, you can't really ask that question linguistically, because there isn't a linguistic answer. Just as the problem itself isn't linguistic, right? Suffering is not the word suffering. Suffering is something that you embody. And meaning is not the word meaning. It's something that happens to you. And so the Taoists would say, well, stand on the line between order and chaos. You can tell when you're there because you're awake and alert and excited and enthusiastic and deep into the moment. And that's a good place to be. And I think the reason that your nervous system does that to you, and this is an evolved issue, is that your brain wants you to be on the line between order and chaos, because that's where dynamic stability is best attained, right? Because your problem is, how do you maintain yourself, right? And then the problem is, how do you maintain yourself optimally? And then the problem is, how do you maintain yourself optimally in a world that continues to transform? And the answer to that isn't, well, you stand still. The answer to that is you transform yourself at the rate that keeps you in sync with the transforming environment. And since we're adapted to transforming environments, there's no reason to assume that when you feel the best about what you're doing, so to speak, there's no reason to assume that that's not exactly where you should be. Why else would you feel like that? Engaged and interested and not plagued by a surfeit of, say, existential problems. And so then meaning becomes something you discover and attempt to inhabit rather than some conceptual answer to a conceptual problem. So